Module 2, Lecture 1. Hi everyone. Today we are going to be talking about lexical aspects of translating psychology terms in research papers. The main objective of this lecture is to study the most effective techniques helpful when translating psychology terms. To provide a theoretical background, there are two major issues under discussion: the phenomenon of translation and specific features of terms. Translating terms. At this point, it is important to note that the distinctive features of scientific style are accuracy, clear logic, compressive character, formality. Accuracy is a basic property of a scientific text, and it should be strictly maintained in translation. Translators must be fully aware of what they are translating to render accurately the content of the text. Special attention must be paid to terms. A term is a word or expression denoting a concept in a particular activity, job, or profession. Terms are considered to have one meaning in one field. Therefore, they are context-free words whose meaning doesn't depend on the context. Contrary to this belief, terms may have more than one meaning. Let's take the term sense, for example, which has many shades of meaning. In physiology, it stands for the capacity of organisms that provides data for perception. In relation to psychology, you can use sense to describe something perceived with your sense organs. In linguistics, sense is one of the possible meanings of a word or phrase. In the technical field, it means one of two opposite directions, especially of motion, as of a point, line, or surface. This gives rise to the problem of term unification. A translator must be very careful about terms expressing the same notion in different fields of knowledge. In this regard, please have a look at the corresponding terms for the Russian ответная реакция. Well, in the biochemical field, it corresponds to the term reaction. In psychology, we use the term response. In electronics, it is feedback. In the area of network technologies, the corresponding term answer back is commonly used. In science, translators tend to translate as accurately as possible because terms are neutral, non-expressive. This relates directly to the notion of literal translation. To begin with, the term translation has several meanings. It can refer to the product, that is the text that has been translated, or the process, that is the act of producing the translation, known as translating. The process of translation between two different languages involves changing an original text in the original language, the source language, into a text in a different language, the target language. Literal translation usually happens when a translator copies the source language form on this or that level of the language. There are several types of literal translation. Some of them are as follows. The type of literal translation on the sound level results in the so-called translator's false friends. That is, words similar in sounds, but different in meaning. Just because words look or sound similar doesn't mean you should assume they have the same meanings in English and Russian. Here are the two great examples of how false friends in the two languages can lead to embarrassing mistakes. Another type of literal translation to be pointed out occurs on the syntactic level. Copying the structure of the source language, translators try to render the meaning word for word, thus breaking combination rules of their native language. As it can be seen from the given example, a literal translation of the source text may turn out clumsy in the target language. That is why translators regard a literal translation unacceptable for some reasons. The message, when translated word for word, gives another meaning, or has no meaning, or is structurally impossible. So, what do you think makes the given translation unsuccessful? Being structurally impossible, it sounds unnatural in Russian because the translator didn't take into account grammatical differences between the two languages. Let us now discuss how the same sentence can be translated another way. Do you agree that the proposed translation reproduces the general meaning of the source message? Yes, generally speaking, it describes the same situation. But the form and content of the original message was reproduced in a way involving a number of formal adjustments. Since many grammatical changes are dictated by the obligatory structures of the target language, we are obliged to make such adjustment as change in word order, though preserving the impersonality expressed by the passive voice. Correspondence in meaning is achieved by reproducing consistency in word usage. However, to sound more natural, there were added some relevant elements. Despite all the adjustments made, it is obvious that readers may be able to perceive much of the original message. That is a way of how you can make your literal translation successful. We now turn to the question of translation problems arising from lexical differences between languages. English and Russian are very different in many important aspects. Lexical differences between the two languages lead to numerous mistakes when translating. For a correct translation, one must know, besides the precise meaning of a word, the way it is combined with other words in a sentence. The meanings of the source language and target language words do not coincide. For guessing the meaning of a word, two types of context are essential in translation. To begin with, context is the text that comes immediately before or after a particular word or phrase and helps to explain its meaning. The context is classified into micro and macro context. The micro context is a word surrounding within a sentence or phrase. The macro context is a larger text, a passage, a story, and the like, where the word is used. For example, in isolation, the word heavy possesses the meaning of great weight, weighty. But depending on the micro context, it corresponds to different Russian words. When combined with the lexical group of words denoting natural phenomena as wind, rain, and so on, it means striking, following with force, abundant. In combination with the word penalty, heavy has the meaning very severe. Moving on, different situations can be named similarly in one language and differently in another language. The following examples fully illustrate this tendency. Some activities taking place in a lab, hospital, or in an office have the same name in Russian, while in English we are obliged to follow the rules of combinability and name them differently. To sum up, it is important to note that the translator must know the exact meaning of the term in this or that field, as well as its combinability. That is, ability to enter into combination with other words, because another word may specify the term and affect its translation. So, to do an accurate translation, it is necessary not only to know the meaning of terms, but also to link them with other words in speech. In doing so, we have to substitute one word for another that naturally fits the context. The next point to consider is techniques used when translating psychology terms. It is understandable that dictionaries cannot provide translators with ready-made solutions to all their problems. Translators start off with words to which they apply particular procedures with the intention of conveying the desired message. The main ways of translating terms are as follows. Transliteration. Writing a word in a different alphabet. When using this technique, a translator should pay special attention to false friends, words similar in form but different in meaning. For example, the Russian word mutilация doesn't correspond to the English mutilation. The next technique under study is calque, a special kind of borrowing by which a specialized meaning of a term in one language is transferred to another language by word-for-word translation. Going on, let me dwell upon lexical transformations, also known as contextual substitutions. These are changes in translation caused by lexical differences between languages. This type of transformations can be classified into several types. Lexical substitution, or putting one word in place of another. As clearly seen from the given examples, the word critical is not always translated as критический. As noted before, it depends on its word combinability. Thus, critical trials is equal to основные пробы. This translation equivalent is predetermined by the word combination it is used in. Another commonly used translation technique is specification, or substituting words with a wider meaning with words of a narrow meaning. It should be taken into consideration that the English language tends to express more general, abstract meanings, while Russian words are more specific. Therefore, in translating from English into Russian, we often employ the transformation of specification, which provides more information by restating it more narrowly. A transformation opposite to specification is generalization, or substituting words of a narrow meaning with those of a wider meaning. Let us refer to the example. The first observation about the translation is that it sounds unnatural, because using calc leads to violated combinability in the target language. The matter is the word mood corresponds to the Russian настроение, расположение духа, thus having a narrow meaning, namely a quality of feeling at a particular time. So, to avoid the inappropriate lexical usage in the target language, we should resort to the substitution with the generic word of a broader meaning, эмоции, define the strong feelings in general. Another important type of transformations you should consider when translating psychology terms is complex transformations, which concern both the lexical and grammatical level, touching upon the structure and meaning of a term. The most widely used translation techniques associated with this type of transformations are reduction, omission, and addition. Let me now briefly comment on each technique. Reduction takes place when one word or a smaller number of words verbalizes a notion. There is a general tendency of the English language to laconic and compressed expressions as compared with Russian. Russian translations are usually of greater volume than their English source texts. For example, the Russian phrase «восстановление нормального психического состояния» или «душевного равновесия» corresponds to a very compressive English word desensitization. Omission presupposes giving up redundant and communicatively irrelevant words. As for the given example, the word interpersonal is omitted due to lexical differences between languages, namely for semantic reasons. The meanings of the word re-victimization in the source and target language do not coincide. In Russian, the meaning is wider, implicitly comprising the component interpersonal, thus making a translator use this omission to avoid redundant information. A transformation opposite to omission is addition. Lexical additions in the target language used to compensate for semantic losses. If you take a closer look at this example, you will see that the proposed translation introduces an extra element that wasn't there in the source language. The use of another word adding to the context is aimed at making clear in the target language the distinction between moral development and some of its levels, including the post-conventional one. Let's move on to some more translation techniques to be taken into account. Among them is analog substitution, used for a receptor's convenience when corresponding similar terms exist in the target language. Look how the English term VR-based body swapping, rendered literally as виртуальный обмен телами, can be substituted with the Russian analog, which conveys the full meaning of the term in relation to psychology, for instance. Going on, I want to tell you a few words about such technique as antonymic translation, which involves describing the situation by the target language from the contrary angle. It can be done through antonyms by substituting a negative construction with an affirmative one, and vice versa. Antonymic translation may be caused by a lack of a regular one-word equivalent in the target language. When translating psychology terms, one can also employ descriptive translation, used for verbalizing new objects not existing in the target language, so that the receptor will have a better understanding of a phrase. Sometimes this transformation is named as explicitation, defined as the technique of making explicit in the target text information that is implicit in the source text. Descriptive translation is often accompanied by the extension of the structure, the addition of new elements. Let us refer to the example to illustrate how the technique works. Apparently, the literal translation is relevant, though many researchers frequently use it in their studies. Nevertheless, a translator should keep in mind that an unsuccessful calque can be extremely unnatural. Calque is not an effective technique to be used in this particular case for semantic reasons. Again, this relates directly to lexical differences between languages. The point is the meanings of the word sensitive in the source and target language do not coincide. In Russian, sensitive stands for чувствительный, связанный с ощущениями, впечатлительный, ранимый. So, such a translation leads to violated combinability or to inappropriate lexical usage in the target language. In doing an accurate translation, we should take into consideration the meaning of this word in the source language, that is needing to be dealt with carefully. Thus, to convey the denoted phenomenon, a descriptive translation seems to be more effective. Let us now discuss the principal advantages and disadvantages of some techniques used when translating psychology terms. The first term under discussion is operationalization of creativity. The evident disadvantage of a literal translation is that it follows closely the form of the source language, sometimes leading to violated combinability or inappropriate lexical usage in the target language. As mentioned before, an unsuccessful calque may sound unnatural or make no sense. In this case, the best way to translate this term as accurately as possible is using the technique of addition. When translating into Russian, it is important to know the exact meaning of the term операционализация, denoting измерение объема понятия с помощью тестов, which promotes the combinability, thus making obvious that the word creativity is used here as a notion, not an ability. So, the complex transformation of addition seems to compensate for this semantic loss. Now for the term vulnerable individuals. It's quite evident that using calque is not effective enough to convey the full meaning of the term in the target language. Preserving the original concept with a broader meaning results in an unsuccessful translation which does not completely fit the context. As it's seen from the proposed translation, using the lexical transformation of specification provides more information by restating it more narrowly as opposed to literal translation, translating a wider, generic meaning of the given term. So, the Russian equivalent «пациенты группы риска» seems to be a successful contextual substitution, given identical, while strictly specific meaning. We now turn to some more examples. First, look at the term genetic and environmental variance, which was rendered literal by a student as генетические и экологические различия. Is it a good example of literal translation? Do you agree with such a translation? What do you disagree with? Are there any mistakes to be taken into consideration? Well, there are two principal mistakes here. The first one was made when translating the word environmental. It is obvious that the proposed Russian equivalent экологический is an example of an unsuccessful calque which sounds extremely unnatural and doesn't make sense. The Russian equivalent различие seems to be rather disputable and provides food for thought. From my subjective point of view, the term under discussion can be translated in various ways by using different translation techniques. Well, which of the proposed translations do you consider the most successful? Which of the techniques used do you personally find the most effective? Considering advantages and disadvantages of the literal translation of the given term, it should be noted that transliteration and calc have the immediately evident disadvantage of not being completely understandable. Though being compressive, direct and strictly specific may be viewed by some translators as an advantage. Compared to the literal translation techniques mentioned above, the evident advantage of the other ones consists in the fact that readers may understand the core of the term due to more explicit, detailed translation. To transmit information as fully as possible in doing an accurate translation, they will introduce structural and lexical changes. The transformation of specifications seems to be one of the most effective translation techniques for some reasons I'm now going to be talking about. Taking into account the micro-context, that is the words surrounding the term within a sentence, namely genetic and environmental variance in relationship quality, as well as its macro-context, the whole paper where the term was used in reference to the quality of the parent-adolescent relationship and relationships with parents, it becomes obvious that the most relevant contextual substitution for the word variance is the Russian equivalent влияние. As for the descriptive translation proposed, it is aimed at delivering the meaning of the source message into the target language, that is, making explicit the information which is not clear in the source text. In doing so, structural changes were introduced by adding some extra elements. To conclude, look at the following diagram presenting the possible translations of the term shared environmental effects. Can you name the translation techniques used? Now please, check your answers. Hopefully, by the end of the lecture, you are capable of differentiating between the techniques used when translating this term. So that is all for now. The lecture has come to its close. For more detailed information, see some useful references. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.